So we're going to go over goals today. It's not going to be what you think. Goals can be one of those really boring, robotic subjects, and I want to give you an alternative perspective. So for any of you listening to any of my podcasts or know me quite well, you know that I'm quite pragmatic. I need to see things in black and white for me to understand them, for me to adopt them and make them part of my actions and my habits. So whenever someone comes to me and they're like, oh, I've got this cool new diet, I lose 5 stone in a day, I'm like, cool, explain it to me. I want to see the black and white, I want to see the rationale. And obviously, one of the main things that you see in the business world is loads of different cliche slogans and motivational quotes. And I'm like, cool, I'm really open and receptive to them as long as I can see the rationale and the logic in them. And today, where I'm going with this is today is one of those things. So there's always that slogan that it is the journey, not the destination. So you can see how this links into goals, because the destination is the goal and the journey is the process of you getting to the goal. So it is the journey, not the destination. And it's one of those things, I was very much team goals. I was always like, well, that's not true. It's definitely the destination. But then I got it explained to me in this way, and I've got like a little weird interest in the brain and neuroscience, so I link into some of that at the end, but I'm not a super expert in any of that, so I don't go into too much detail, but I explain it in black and white why goals are kind of not as important as we think and what is actually important. So one of the main things to explain is that exercise should not be a means to an end. This is something you'll hear me say quite often, and that it should be a part of our everyday lives. I truly think that the media and social media and other media outlets have done a great job of demonizing exercise and making it this thing that these narcissistic, ego-driven people do to achieve a means to an end, be it, you know, looking a certain way, or being it achieving a certain social status, or getting shredded for Ocean Beach in the summer, or even the things like going for a wedding or whatever it might be. So ultimately, exercise has turned into this thing that, at a base level, exercise is there to improve our physical health and our mental health, and that is the most important thing, but it is often not perceived like that. So I want to get that out there because it'll start to make sense as we go into this. So when we look at goals, there are 2 main types. There are temporary goals and there are permanent goals. So in a real black and white way, most people listening to the video are really only going to have permanent goals. So what I mean by this is, for an example with me, actually I've got examples here, why am I explaining it? So an example of a temporary goal will be swimming around Great Britain. Anyone who knows Ross Edgley? He swam around the whole of Great Britain in 2018, didn't step foot on land, took him about 5 months, swam through the night, slept on a boat. It was pretty hectic. And you can imagine that what he had to do to get to, this is where it gets important, what he had to do to get into a position to swim around Great Britain, there was some major sacrifices that had to be made there, and some major effort and some major pain and discomfort. You can imagine he didn't get back on land and just start going, I can't wait to do that again next year, or I can't wait to do that again next week, or just permanently do that. He was thinking pizza, bed, beer, girlfriend. He didn't even, like, that goal was done for him. So it was temporary. But for us non-superhuman folk, we're going to have majorly permanent goals. An example of this would be losing 2 stone. So it's a great example for me in fitness and exercise and the industry is that people want to lose 2 stone, but when they lose that 2 stone, they don't just want to revert back to the original weight, they want to keep that 2 stone off. And that's really important, and that's something that we don't reiterate enough, is that when we have these goals, it's not just about getting to the goal, it's about maintaining the position that the goal puts us in. An example for me, with my business trying to grow Collective Fitness, one of the things that I want to do is have 1,000 members in the first 12 months. I don't want to revert back to 500 members in month 13. I want to keep those 1,000 members. And that's the perspective and the paradigm shift we initially need to have. So with humans, we're very A to Z thinkers. We are at A, and all we think about is Z. We don't acknowledge what is in between, which is a very big downfall, and I'll explain why in a minute. We want to get to Z, but we ignore B, C, D, and so on and so forth in between. And ultimately, what we think is Z is what equals happiness, which is why we focus on that Z position so much. We're constantly thinking about Z, and what we don't think about is everything in between, because we feel that when we get to Z, it equals happiness, and we're going to have that sense of satisfaction. But we are wrong, and I'll explain why in a minute. So, when we have a goal, we have us, and we have future us, future you. Future you, if the goal is -2 stone, the future you will be down 2 stone. And then ultimately we've got that journey in between us currently and future you. And the main thing that needs to happen for us to get between me and future you is new habits and behaviours. This is where it gets quite important. I've said this about 3 times now. This is quite important. So for us to have new habits and behaviours, what we need to acknowledge is that between waking and going to sleep, our day is just a series of actions, and those actions are habits, behaviours, decisions, problems, and how we counter those, and so on and so forth. That is what makes up who we are, what happens when we are awake, and those actions that happen when we are awake. If I'm 2 stone overweight, there is something wrong in those actions. So for me to lose that 2 stone, I need to identify what new actions and habits need to happen for me to get to future me where I've lost 2 stone. I need to identify what the habits and the behaviours are of the -2 stone me, so that I can gradually implement them over a period of time. And obviously I won't look at future me and go, all the habits and behaviours are going to have. I'm going to look at my habits and behaviours now and gradually mould them into future me. But the problem is that generally a lot of people don't do this. When they get to that 2 stone mark, or the -2 stone mark, so their weight loss goal, they will often circle back and revert to their original weight. And people will do this in all walks of life, not just weight loss. And the reason, not always, but the majority of the reason that this happens is because ultimately we try and ascertain habits and behaviours that don't fit in with our lifestyle or are unsustainable for the long run. So that's really important, that we choose habits that we can't sustain for the long run. A great example of this is when people try to lose weight in a really condensed period of time. For me to do that, the habits and behaviours that are required for that are near on impossible for me to maintain for the longer period of time. So what happens is they revert back to old you and they go in a big full circle, and they ultimately fall off the bandwagon, which is something you'll hear me say quite a lot, which is what we try and prevent, which is why we feel exercise should be a part of everybody's life for the long run. But what we want to do is when we get to that -2 stone mark, we want to keep it there for the long run. And what is the difference between those 2 scenarios? Scenario 1, where we reverted back to our old ways, is we didn't have the new habits and behaviours and we didn't maintain them. But scenario 2, where we did and we stayed at that weight loss position, is we maintained the new habits and behaviours that we adopted to get to the goal in the first place. So to stew on that for a second, you can kind of see what's happening here. Actually, the goal isn't really the goal. The habits and behaviours that the goal forces us to adopt is the overall outcome of this. We'll go into that a little bit more in a second. So, but ultimately, one of the main things that we see is that humans are very pursuit-based beings, is that we are constantly after something and we are constantly trying to drive towards a new position. You see this a lot with athletes when they get towards whatever goal or thing they originally set out to do, is that when they achieve that and there's not really a next stepping stone, is that they have kind of this like post-traumatic, I don't know if that's the right word, but like this like kind of like post-traumatic stress where is it post-traumatic stress? Anyway, they get like a little bit down and because ultimately they were so focused on that effort process to get towards that goal that once they are there, they now have no vision of where they want to go, because humans are very pursuit-based beings and athletes are the epitome of that. They are pure pursuit-driven. So what we often see is when people get to their goal, they just go to the next goal and the next goal after that and the next goal after that. And ultimately what drives this goal acquisition process is the habits and behaviours that help us get towards those stepping stones. And now ultimately, if you want to get real deep and kind of high level with this, that's all life is. That's us going from one stepping stone to the other and changing our habits and behaviours to go from each of those stepping stones. And you see the people who revert into really negative behavioural patterns, it's because they've either lost their good habits and behaviours and they've gone by the wayside and they've let them go, or they've adopted bad habits and behaviours, or a little bit of both. Anyway, so in summary, a goal is simply a marker. The goal is the reason we start this journey. So we can start to see now the goal actually isn't that really major important thing that it's made out to be, and that people get so caught up on. And then when we envision this goal, we think we have to get there in the shortest space of time, but we can now start to see that actually getting to that goal in the shortest space of time is not the most important thing. It's getting the habits and behaviors that get us there, which is where that slogan that we said at the start, the motivational quote, that it's not the destination, it is the journey, is so important. So a goal does not equal happiness, like I just said, even though sometimes we think it does, and at a certain level it will provide us a sense of satisfaction, but the goal does not equal happiness. A goal takes consistency and effort to achieve, which ultimately consistency and effort equal new habits and behaviours, because if I do something more frequent enough and it requires effort, I need to put that into a habit form, which is something that I do subconsciously and it's part of my normal daily habits. New habit, new behaviour. So a goal is simply a mark or a reason to start. A goal does not equal happiness, and a goal takes consistency, effort and new habits and behaviours. And without the habits and behaviours, we ultimately lose that goal, because we revert back to our old set of habits and behaviours which equal the previous version of ourselves or our business or our health or whatever it might be. And that ultimately, therefore, the goal is not the goal itself. The goal is the habits and behaviours it forces us to adopt. So to reiterate on that, goal is simply a marker and a reason to get going and start. The goal does not actually equal the happiness, because the goal takes such consistency and effort, which helps us form new habits and behaviours. And without the habits and behaviours, we ultimately lose that goal that we initially set out to achieve. Therefore, the goal in itself is not the goal. The goal is the habits and behaviours it forces us to adopt. I don't think we've ever said goal so many times in one paragraph. So another thing that we hear is learn to enjoy the process, and this is something that I very much used to say. And then like I said at the start, I've got very much an interest in the brain and how it works. And I had a really interesting podcast by a gentleman called Andrew Huberman, who's a neuroscientist, and he explained this process. And then these two concepts really started to merge together and make a lot of sense for me. So when we look at dopamine is your brain's way of rewarding the effort process. So people most know dopamine for things like caffeine and cocaine and other drugs, because it releases high levels of dopamine, which gives us this sense of this wellness and loveliness and satisfaction and energy. The main purpose of dopamine is our brain's way of rewarding effort to push back on physical and mental fatigue. So when we have to put effort into something, it induces physical and mental fatigue. When the brain releases dopamine, it pushes back on that effort, on that fatigue, so that that effort continues and forms new habits and behaviours. I know it's getting a little bit technical now, but bear with me. So ultimately, so that you can continue along that effort process, the dopamine reinforces that, so you can continue along the effort process to form, you guessed it, new habits and behaviours. So you can start to see this journey all syncing up now. We identify what the goal is. The goal gets us moving. It gets us off our arse, off our sofa, outside, and starts commencing us in activity. That's what it's job to do. The effort starts to increase. The going gets tough. The dopamine recognises the small win, whatever it might be. The brain recognises the small win or whatever it might be, and starts to feed you dopamine to encourage that process to repeat itself until it forms itself into a new habit and behaviour. The best way to explain this is when, if we use the caveman example, everyone loves to use the caveman analogy. If the caveman's out and he's got to go and find water for his tribe, he may go on this long haul journey to get to the water. It's not as simple as going to the shop. He has to go and find a lake that could be a long way away. So he has to go on the hunt. He has to go and find it. And then he might find a little stream. The stream is a marker. It's that B, C, D point on our road to Z, on our road to our goal. Brain releases dopamine. You're tired. It is a lot of effort, but we are on the right path, and this habit and this behaviour is crucial to our survival and our success. We follow that stream a little bit more. The stream turns into a river, more dopamine. That river turns into a massive flowing river, more dopamine, reinforcing that process and that habit as the going gets more tough and tough. we found the lake, happy days, goal achieved. And you can start to see the relationship now, how this falls back to exercise. I could line up a giant list of people here who all told me that they hated exercise from the outset, yet you fast forward 4-6 weeks and they're like, oh, really enjoy this now. So how can someone go from not enjoying something and then they induce fatigue and tiredness, and they start to see and they start to engage in that effort process, and now they're like, actually I am enjoying it. How does that work? That works because our brain knows that these actions are positive to our overall survival and success, so it reinforces that with dopamine. Now, when we look at that whole bigger process, you've got you're traveling to future you where you want to lose 2 stone, you've got the new habits and behaviors, and ultimately dopamine is what helps create those new habits and behaviors that ultimately get us from A to B. So dopamine, hence why the build up to a goal is often more memorable than the goal itself. Like I mentioned with athletes earlier, and I can line up countless weight loss clients who have all experienced this, when they get to the goal, they report it as being quite unremarkable. And this is because when you ask them to reflect upon it, they don't think about the moment they stepped on the scales and they looked and it said what they wanted it to say. They think, I remember when I got my first pull-up, or I did my first box jump, or I did my first row, or Connor said how amazing I was doing. All these little small wins along the process that the brain knows are crucial to the bigger success and survival of you. So reinforces it every time you have that sense of satisfaction and celebration. It's coming from that dopamine response in the brain. So summary, so the point of goal is to provide you with direction and get you to do something until the new habits and behaviors start to kick in and this dopamine reward process starts to commence. So you have you're traveling to future you where you need to lose 2 stone. The goal, that initial outset of what you're going to do, is what gets you moving and kicks you into gear. Your brain then starts to release dopamine to reward that effort process, which ultimately reinforces the new habits and behaviors you start to learn. And then ultimately we will carry on an upward trajectory, continuing this process from one goal to the next goal to the next goal. So in summary, we need to enjoy what we do. From an initial starting point of view, you need to think that if I'm gonna, like I mentioned, we need to go for that initial phase where we try and get to that effort reward process. So we need to look at the different pathways in front of us. If I want to lose weight, I can do that through running, through Zumba, through the gym, through CrossFit, through swimming. I want to look at those different processes and what I know that I'm most likely to enjoy. I need to potentially adopt that process. Obviously, we have to take into consideration other things like how that's going to fit into my lifestyle and is it realistic? Can I do that every single day, or can I do that and that actually help me get towards my goal within the framework of my life? But we also need to respect that sometimes we can do something and you might just enjoy it anyway because of the whole reward process and the sense of satisfaction and achievement and happiness that you get from the dopamine reward process. Number 2, it needs to be sustainable. As I mentioned at the start with that whole diagram of when you drip off because you do something in an unsustainable amount of time, which means you form habits and behaviors that are unsustainable for the long run. So whatever goal that we choose to do, you need to consider how sustainable that is going to be once you hit that goal. And how do we know that? We know that through the habits and behaviors we are going to have to adopt because they are key to success. If I look at a goal and the goal is forcing me to adopt habits and behaviors that are ultimately not realistic for me to carry on once I've achieved that goal, then it's going to be a bad decision for us to go down that path. A great example of this would be the bodybuilding industry, where you see guys step on stage and they're absolutely shredded, incredibly low body fat percentages, but within like weeks of them stepping on stage, they've completely reverted back to where they were like 6 months ago, because the habits and behaviors they had to adopt are completely unrealistic for them to sustain for a long period of time. And this kind of circles back to what I was saying at the beginning about how the media portrays things in the wrong way, because you see those people in a snapshot moment, they only look like that for that singular 24-hour day, and they start reverting back to their old habits and behaviors. So it's really unrealistic for us to try and ascertain to do that. So when we approach a goal or a pathway or whatever we are looking to do, we need to make sure that we're going to enjoy it, but also trust that we might enjoy the process anyway. You need to approach it in a way that's going to be sustainable for the long run, and you do that by identifying what habits and behaviors are going to be required to do that, and if they fit into your lifestyle. Right, that was a long one. Thank you for listening, guys, and take care.